today, as I hope, I think you know, and we are going to the Russia and the Soviet interpretation in the philosophy, and particularly in the Marxist philosophy of the Soviet tradition. And we have as our guest Daniela Stejla and Sergei Biaresh. I hope to well pronounce the surname. And Daniela Stejla is a professor of history of Russian philosophy in the University of Turin. And Sergei Biaresh is a visiting assistant professor at the University of Pennsylvania, and he teaches at the German Languages and Literature Department. And I want only to remind you the following debates, the following meetings that are that we have planned. That will be the next one in November, the 29th of November. We will speak about the André Tosel interpretation of Spinoza, and we will have with us Chantal Jacquet and David Maruzzella. And then the next year, in the April of 2023, in the 13th April of 2023, we will speak about Spinoza in the Althusser Marxism with Juan Domingo Sanchez Estop and Esteban Dominguez. And the last one debate in the 27th April of 2023 about Toni Negri and the Spinoza in the theoretical and political interpretation of Toni Negri with ours Morfino and De Lucchese. And today Daniela is going to speak firstly about the first half of the last century and about Plekhanov and the first half of the century, and Biaresh particularly about the second half, Ilienkov and the 60s. And so I give to Daniela the floor, and thank you to everyone to be with us today.
So thank you very much for the introduction and for inviting me here. I think I am again out. I'm not an organizer anymore, so I cannot share the screen. Now I can. It's great. So let's do that before it changes its mind. So, okay, here we go. So thank you for having me here and for the chance to talk about a topic that I worked on for a while, and I'm afraid I won't be able actually to talk about the first half of the century. I will stop myself much earlier, I'm afraid. But let's go immediately into the thing. So it is well known, it's a fact, that Spinoza was the most influential figure in both Russian and Soviet Marxism, making this sort of difference before and after the revolution of 1917 and the creation of Soviet Union. So let's say that the importance of Spinoza as a philosopher that every thinker or current in Soviet Marxism wanted to be on their side was pointed out in 1952 by George Klein, who was a pioneer in the field in his masterpiece, Spinoza in Soviet Philosophy. As you can see from the table of contents, the volume comprehended English translations of important Soviet authors, mainly within the debates of the 20s between so-called mechanists and the Borinists, an impressive bibliography and a long introduction. which is an essay on its own about Spinoza's influence in Russia before and after the revolution. In the third section, particularly, Klein outlined 4 schools of Spinoza's interpretations among Russian Marxists: Plekhanov and the Bornates, the mechanists, the orthodox Marxism. So I'm sorry, I think, I think since I am the organizer, I also have to let people in. So, okay, I did it. Orthodox Marxism, I was saying, is the third that Klein identifies around the 30s with the definition of Stalin's ideology. And for the fourth current was the revisionist Marxism, so-called, which is something that I personally like better to call as critical Marxism. But although the debates of the 20s are by no means very, very interesting, I will talk today on something else. Also because about those debates, if anybody wants to know more, there is a great translation of an very important work that it's a sort of a classic. It's Yehoshua Yakov's The Suppression of Philosophy in the USSR. It came out in Russian in New York in 1981, and then it appeared 10 years ago already in an English translation. So today my argument is the different interpretations of Spinoza's thought within Russian Marxism, let's say, surely up to the 20s, and at the same time depended on and supported different ideas of Marxism. In particular, I would like to sketch out 3 main interpretations. Spinoza's thought as ontological monism connected with psychophysical parallelism. Spinoza's thought as a method of understanding the whole of reality, and Spinoza's thought as a way of feeling the connection of the individual with the whole. Plekhanov, Bogdanov, Lunacharsky, for those who want to have an idea about the people I'm going to talk about. So first of all, Georgy Valentinovich Plekhanov, who is well known as the father of Russian Marxism, a very well-known Marxist thinker at his time, highly respected in the whole of the international Marxism and in general social democracy at the time. In the early 80s, still in Soviet time, I had the chance to work in this amazing environment, the Dom Plekhanov Archive and Library in St. Petersburg. At the time, it was still Leningrad. The result was my tesi di laurea and then a book which came out in 1991. In Dom Plekhanova, one can find a great quantity of Plekhanov's papers and books, which are particularly important in order to understand better how Plekhanov studied certain authors, with questions he read them, and from what perspective. And that includes, obviously, Spinoza. So Plekhanov considers Spinoza to be the first thinker who correctly, let's say, understood the fundamental ontological problem, since he maintained the unity of being and thought without reducing one to the other. Thought and extension are different expressions of the same substance, which allows us to overcome any kind of dualism of body and mind while considering the human being. In one of Plekhanov's notebooks, dating back to the first half of the 1890s, we read a quotation from Spinoza's Ethics in the context of notes and commentaries on La Métrie and other French materialists. Plekhanov there copied in Latin the first two propositions of the second part, followed by the second axiom of the second part. So Spinoza as a monist thinker. Since Spinoza formulated a consistent monistic system, Plekhanov thought that any further monism, including materialism and Marxism, was to be considered a revival of Spinozism. When the German Spinozist Jakob Stern invited the Marxists to return to Spinoza, which happened at the end of the 19th century, rather than to return to Kant, Plekhanov objected that Marxist materialism could not and had not to return to Spinoza, since Marxism itself was nothing else than a variant of Spinozism. Contemporary materialism merely represents more or less conscious Spinozism. To reinforce the continuity between Spinozism and Marxism, Plekhanov called upon Friedrich Engels' authority. In 1889, Plekhanov reported he and another well-known Russian Marxist at the time, Pavel Axelrod, were visiting Engels, and there Engels himself stated that old Spinoza was really right in considering thought and extension as two attributes of the same substance. The argument was not the best, obviously. In 1898, that was the time when Plekhanov told the story, Engels was not around anymore to confirm Plekhanov's account. It is meaningful, however, because it says something about the effort Plekhanov made to pull Spinoza on his own side. I have been working and writing about this many times. I will just point out here a couple of questions in order to show on what philosophical foundation Plekhanov built up the image of Spinoza as a forerunner of his orthodox Marxism. Orthodox in the sense that it was against German revisionism. First of all, Plekhanov deemed that Spinoza's monism deeply affected the entire history of modern materialism, 18th century French materialism, but also Feuerbach. His marginalia on the pages of several different editions of Spinoza's Ethics in German, Latin, and Russian, conserved in the Don Plekhanova Library, confirmed this interpretation. Here I'm showing an example from Jakob Stern's German translation. Spinoza there wrote, thinking substance and extended substance are one and the same substance, which is comprehended sometimes under the one and sometimes under the other attribute. So too the mode of extension and the idea of that mode are one and the same thing, but expressed in two ways. And I'm using here the 2018 English translations, Cambridge University Press. Plekhanov underlined this passage and jotted down materialism, confront Feuerbach. According to Plekhanov, both Spinoza and Feuerbach maintained the basic principle of materialistic monism. The laws of being are at the same time the laws of thought. Feuerbach's positions reminds a famous statement by Spinoza, ordo et connexio idearum, idem est ac ordo et connexio rerum. On the basis of his sound monistic ontology, according to Plekhanov, Spinoza developed a theory of knowledge that was to be considered a fundamental contribution to materialism as well. Plekhanov was particularly interested in Spinoza's first kind of knowledge, since, according to Plekhanov, the theory of sensation is the necessary foundation of any epistemology. Plekhanov was particularly interested in this passage from the Ethics. All the modes wherein one body is affected by another body follow simultaneously from the nature of the body affected and the body affecting, so that one and the same body may be moved in different modes according to the difference in the nature of the bodies moving it. On the other hand, different bodies might be moved in different modes by one and the same body. This is somehow something very close to Plekhanov's own theory of knowledge, particularly the so-called theory of hieroglyphics, firstly exposed in the 7th note to Plekhanov's own translation of Engel's Ludwig Feuerbach. Our sensation, we read in this note, are some kind of hieroglyphics that make us aware of what is happening in reality. Hieroglyphics do not resemble the events they communicate, but they are capable of communicating with absolute accuracy the events themselves and, what is of prime importance, the relations which exist between them. Although he modified his terminology later, giving up the weird word hieroglyphics, Plekhanov did not change the main idea. Our sensations strictly correspond to reality, but they are not reflection of reality themselves. And if you look at these, again, at the quotation by Spinoza, there are some striking analogies with some physiological discoveries or theories, such as Johannes Müller's theory of the specific energy of nerves, or in Russia, Ivan Sechenov's views on sensations, which Plekhanov himself considered mostly influential. As it's well known that Plekhanov's theory of hieroglyphics, and more general, his theory of correspondence, his epistemology of correspondence, was a serious point of disagreement with Lenin. Instead, Lenin proposed a theory of reflection. But even during the times of deepest theoretical, but also political disagreement, Lenin never stopped to consider Plekhanov a master in philosophy. In 1921, Lenin famously said about Plekhanov, "One cannot become a conscious, real communist without studying," I repeat, studying, everything Plekhanov wrote on philosophy, since it is the best in the whole of international Marxist literature. Quotations like this helped Plekhanov's thought to navigate the hard times when the new Soviet orthodoxy was organized. So Plekhanov was highly considered all through the 20s and also later. So much that in the 20s, his philosophical legacy became an issue in the controversies between so-called Deborinits and or dialectical Marxists on one hand and mechanists on the other. The problem also intertwined personal biographies. Abram Deborin, which you see on the left, and Lyubov Axelrod on the right, have been two of the closest followers of Plekhanov. And now they found themselves on the opposite sides. Also about Spinoza's interpretation. The Deborinists saw the core of Spinoza's materialism in his theory of substance as nature, ultimately identifiable with extension and matter. On the other hand, according to the mechanists, Spinoza's substance was to be understood as the universal regularity of the world, the mechanical causality that rules the whole of nature, and natural sciences study in details. To identify substance and with matter, as the Deborinites did, seemed to the mechanists a misconception, since matter, in extension, is just one of the many attributes of substance. And the essential character of substance is to be causa sui. The mechanists were condemned in 1929. The Deborinists followed. Oh, there is somebody. The microphone. Then I hope they can stop, because otherwise.
Luca De Barbieri, dovresti spegnere il microfono, per favore.
I think we could do that by
Sì,
as organizer. I cannot find. Okay, thank you. So I was saying the mechanists were condemned in 1939. The Boronites followed in 1931. But this is a story I don't want to tell today. So let's go to our second main interpretation. Spinoza's thought as a method of understanding the whole of reality. The hero here is Alexander Bogdanov. At least he is one of my heroes. Important, influential, now very widely discussed by system theorists within ecology.
Posso scaricarlo?
No, it's still not working. Sorry. Can we just?
Non ce l'ho.
I might find a way to be very. No, okay, it stopped. Perfect. Thank you. So Bogdanov is now very widely discussed. For instance, Carlo Rovelli in Helgoland recently talked about him. Molecular Red a few years ago by Mackenzie work put out the interest of, and in general, system thinkers are working on that a lot. But as for his Spinoza, Bogdanov interpreted his thought from a methodological rather than an ontological standpoint, which was exactly what Plekhanov did to pointed out the ontological question first. So according to Bogdanov, God or nature in Spinoza means that general necessity, which is hidden in all the phenomena, which generates and connects all of them, or in other words, their causal connection. Exactly on this basis, during the debates of the 20s between mechanists and the Boronites, Bogdanov was often considered as standing on the side of the first. It is not surprising that, according to Bogdanov, Spinoza's substantialism was not the strongest, but the weakest point of his thought. Bogdanov developed a position that many of you already know, that we could call constructivist. The basis of our knowledge and more generally of our interactions with the world are our sensations that we organize socially in the external world and psychologically in the internal world. The echo of empirical criticism here is very clear, and that is also why Lenin attacked Bogdanov and this group, calling them Machists in materialism and empirical criticism. Both Ernst Mach and Richard Avenarius, the two founders of empirical criticism, had a certain connection with Spinoza. In his preface to the analysis of sensations, Mach put Spinoza among his forerunners. Avenarius' connection with Spinoza was even stronger. He started his academic career with a doctoral thesis on Spinoza's pantheism, and moreover, in his main work, Critique of Pure Experience, he sometimes referred to Spinoza once in particular regarding the relation of mind and body and the role of physiology in the nervous system. Avenarius quotes this passage: "For no one has yet determined what actions the body can do. That is, experience has not yet taught anyone what actions the body can and cannot do without being determined by the mind simply on the basis of the laws of nature, insofar as nature is viewed solely as corporeal. For no one has yet achieved such an accurate knowledge of the body's structures that he could explain all its functions." We will come back to this same passage at the end of my presentation, but here I would just like to emphasize that Bogdanov found particularly intriguing Spinoza's theory of emotion, because exactly he put emotions within the body. Bogdanov considered emotions to be indicators of the energy balance of the organism. As such, they should be considered as part of extension, which comprehends both the physical experience of the world and the big part of the psychic experience of the subjects, the emotions. In Bogdanov's view, Spinoza's attribute of thought is not the psychic in general, which comprehends all the emotions, but the logical aspect of the word. So Spinoza's thought as a method and not as substance. Weirdly, maybe, here comes the third interpretation I wanted to point out today. Lunacharsky's Spinoza. Spinoza's thought, according to him, is a way of feeling the connection of the individual with the whole. Lunacharsky is probably better known as a political leader. He was the Minister of Education in the first Bolshevik government. But he was also a very interesting and very original philosopher. In particular, his second volume of a huge work that he published in 1908 and 1911 with the title Religion and Socialism, sketch a whole philosophical history of socialism, very different from the one established by Plekhanov. In his work, Lunacharsky went through the same authors Plekhanov had chosen, Spinoza, French materialist, Feuerbach, Marx, but in a different way. According to Plekhanov, Spinoza's theological, religious language, his pantheism, was to be considered an unavoidable relic of the epoch. Lunacharsky, on the contrary, maintains that it was precisely his religious feelings that made Spinoza a forerunner of Marxism. According to his own definition of religion, religion is a thought or even a sensation of the world in which the laws of life, that is, the laws of the human being, and the laws of nature are reconciled. In this sense, both religion and work are attempts to reconcile humankind and nature. In this perspective, both Spinoza and Marxism could and should be considered a religion. Lunacharsky wrote, is Spinozism a religion? From the standpoint of our definition of religion, we must acknowledge Spinoza's pantheism as a religious philosophical system without any doubt. The very title of his fundamental work, The Ethics, shows that his aim was moral. Spinoza wanted to point out to people a new ground for life. Reconciliation is the last chord of this amazing symphony of ideas. The love for God, for Enkai Pan, is the note which resonates more loudly. And this is Lunacharsky. I mean, a very serious sound Marxism, but this kind of sort of bizarre one. So he also, in the same volume, paid sort of a tribute to Avenarius. Lunacharsky studied with Avenarius in Zurich for a very short time at the end of the 19th century. But that short time he always considered fundamental for his entire life. Here he writes, the heart of Spinozism is the discovery, using Avenarius' term, of the perfect independent, which is an idea wholly independent from the world of experience and the adversities of fate, an idea that solves in a peculiar way any vital divergence. The terms vital divergence is used in Avenarius' sense to mean all the breaks of balance that make human life proceed toward a higher, a further state of balance. The idea of the whole, which reveals itself in Spinoza's third kind of knowledge, represents the solution for any kind of unbalance. Once achieved the consideration of events sub specie aeternitatis, we persuade ourselves that all perfections are imaginary, that within the whole they do not exist because everything is perfect. So all perfections are imaginary. Everything is reconciled. Curiously enough, it could be sort of expected that Lunacharsky changed his mind once Marxism was already settled as a non-religious thought in the 20s, but actually not. Lunacharsky republished the second volume of Religion and Socialism in 1925 with some changes. Since Bogdanov and his fellow Machists became at the time the object of a new wave of harsh criticism connected with the second edition in 1920 of Lenin's Materialism and Empiriocriticism, Lunacharsky practically removed all the references to Machism from the 1925 editions, and also he revised the religious terminology. Of course, I mean, he was one of the main leader in the fight against religion for atheism. And also Plekhanov was criticized less in the second edition. But the basis of Lunacharsky's views on Spinoza and his pantheism, as well as the general idea of Marxism as something implying feelings as well as ideas, is still there. This is the quotation that ends the book, and it's actually something that Lunacharsky writes particularly for this second edition. Whatever is said about the excessive intellectualistic tendency of our revolution, in its conscious manifestations, it is full of passionate feeling as an element of that Marxism, which is certainly its dominant force as a theory. But enemies and people not involved in it sometimes still accuse Marxism of dryness and coldness. This book aims to give an outline of Marxism as a consistent worldview. It wants to provide an opportunity to feel all the unrivaled depth and luxury of emotions with which the consciousness of an active Marxist naturally lives. I think at this point it is quite clear that actually the different interpretations of Spinoza depended on and supported different ideas of Marxism. That was my argument at the beginning. In conclusion, I would like to make just a little step further and ask myself what exactly was so interesting in Spinoza. Is there anything that appeared to be interesting and important for all these different interpretations? I think that the point is exactly that Spinoza's I thought can be viewed as a materialism without reductionism. And that was a brilliant idea according to all of the interpreters I pointed out. There are different ideas about what it means to be without reductionism, but the idea that the brilliancy of Spinoza stay there is sort of shared. And just to give a hint of what is going on further, I would just point out that also in Lev Vygotsky's thought, that is true. So Spinoza is considered brilliant exactly because of this. I do not have time to dwell on these amazing psychologists and the philosopher, but let me just point out that as an epigraph of his well-known work on the psychology of art, Vygotsky quotes exactly the same passage we talked about Avenario's critique of pure experience. It's cut differently, but it's the same passage. According to Vygotsky as well, Spinoza's offered a non-reductionist materialism, which could be extremely productive in the developing a new dialectical psychology. He wrote, for instance, in one of his last works in 1930, we must consider the psychic not as particular processes that exist in addition, above or next to the brain processes, somewhere above or between them, but as the subjective expression of those same processes, as a particular aspect, a particular qualitative characteristic of the higher functions of the brain. And actually, Spinoza helps in that. For the dialectical psychology, the psyche is not, in Spinoza's words, something that is beside nature as a state in the state. It is part of nature itself, immediately connected to the function of the organized higher matter of our brain. Like all of the nature, it was not created but arose in a process of development. So Spinoza again appeared to play a role exactly as a non-reductionist materialist, we could say a physicalist, probably more accurately. But I'm running out of time. I hope I didn't take too much. So thank you. And I will be mute. Thank you.
Thank you to you, Daniela, for a so clear and brilliant presentation and about the different Spinoza in the different Marxist currents. And I immediately give the floor to Sergei to continue the history.
Thank you. Thank you, the organizers, for inviting me. And I also wanted to extend my thanks to my students and colleagues here at the University of Pennsylvania, one of whom, Sam, at least I see here, with whom I really developed these thoughts. I'm posting in the chat a document, link to a document with a few quotes, if you care to follow. So in this paper, I will show how Evald Ilyenkov, a Soviet philosopher who inspired the revival of critical Marxism in the 1950s and 70s in the Soviet Union and beyond, produces a specifically Spinozan reading of Chapter 1 of Marxist Capital on commodity and money form. In order to develop a materialist concept of thought in Marx, Ilyenkov advances a concept of the ideal. This enables Ilyenkov to present the derivation of the money form in Chapter 1 as, quote, the dialectic of the transformation of a thing into a symbol and of a symbol into a sign. Ilyenkov's interpretation, I will show, hinges on Spinoza's conception of thought and in the way that it relates to language. While Spinoza's view of language as a source of error and inadequate knowledge poses a challenge to the possibility of symbolic representation of adequate knowledge, Ilyenkov's concept of the ideal, in turn, provides, via Marx, a reading of Spinoza's adequate knowledge as constituted by symbolically mediated practical activity. Before proceeding to Ilyenkov's reading, I will briefly outline Spinoza's theory of language. The major distinction that runs through the theory of language and adequate knowledge is the caesura between thought and language. Spinoza conceives thought and extension as two attributes of substance, while being adamant that thought and extension do not affect one another insofar as they are expressions of one and the same thing. Spinoza writes, the body cannot determine the mind to thinking, and the mind cannot determine the body to motion, to rest, or to anything else. Spinoza locates words, whether spoken or written, on the level of extension. Quote, for the essence of words and of images is constituted only by corporeal motions, which do not at all involve the concept of thought. Words, like images, are formed by linking the affections of the body. Quote, the affections of the human body whose ideas present external bodies as present to us, we shall call images of things, and when the mind regards bodies in this way, we shall say that it imagines. Since, as Spinoza points out, we cannot speak a word unless we recollect it, the passage from images to words entails the function of memory and habit, through which the encounters the body undergoes are linked together, that is, quote, a certain connection of ideas involving the nature of things which are outside the human body, a connection that is in the mind according to the order and connection of the affections of the human body. Habit and memory do not rely on similitude, just as a signifier and signified are essentially dissimilar. So, quote Spinoza, from the thought of the word pomum, a Roman will immediately pass to the thought of the fruit, which has no similarity to that articulate sound and nothing in common with it except that the body of the same man has often been affected by these two. Insofar as the affections of the body are the same as the ideas of the mind, this discussion of language via imagination provides a linkage, in no way causal, between ideas and images. As Marot points out, I quote Marot, language thus has the particularity of not only tying together an idea and an image, it ties together an idea with two images. That is, I elaborate, modification of the body linked by habit to previous modifications of the body. The word is thus like the image of an image. Spinoza's conception of language is at the same time a programmatic critique of language with respect to the production of adequate knowledge. This is because, as Spinoza points out, quote, the idea of any affection of the human body does not involve adequate knowledge of an external body, and moreover, quote, the ideas which we have of external bodies indicate the condition of our body more than the nature of the external bodies. To reduce an idea to the linkage of images amounts to treating ideas as mute pictures on a panel. This is the process of the formation of universals like man, horse, dog, which cannot grasp the singularity of bodies due to the erasure of their differences that permits us to concentrate in a word, I'm quoting Marot here, an inadequately affirmed image of a large number of singular beings, which alone are real in the strict sense of the word. And so, as Spinoza says, we confuse universals with singulars and beings of reason and abstractions with real things. In short, language and any process of symbolization for that matter, which arises as linkage of images, is perpetually haunted by inadequate knowledge. It is, in fact, the cause of most errors, as Spinoza points out. So the question arises, what is the function of symbolization with respect to the production of adequate knowledge? Is adequate knowledge in the medium of language possible at all? Not only does Ilyenka answer this question in the affirmative, yes, it is possible. I will argue that the very process of symbolization, while an obstacle to adequate knowledge, is also its condition of possibility, an aspect that becomes evident in Ilyenkov's concept of the ideal that he develops in conjunction of reading Spinoza and Marx's Capital. Ilyenkov emphasizes that thought as such is an abstraction. I quote, thought and extension do not in reality exist in themselves, but only as nature's bodies linked by chains of interaction. Thought is inseparable from a really existing body. Quote, thought is a mode of existence of the body, just as its extension is its mode of existence, as its particular configuration and position among other bodies. That is to say, in individuated bodies, it is nature itself that thinks. The essential character of thought is the activity of a thinking body, which is at the same time expressed in extended activity. There is no causal relation between extended body and thought because, Ilyenkov argued, quote, thought is not the product of an action, but the action itself, considered at the moment of its performance, just as walking, for example, is the mode of action of the legs, the product of which is the traversed space. Consequently, Ilyenkov concludes, quote, if a thinking body is inactive, it is no longer a thinking body, but simply a body. But when it does act, it does not do so on thought because its very activity is thought. The active capacity of the thinking body is a specific manifestation of nature's power of self-actualization. Quote, the intersection and combination of plurality of causal chains may lead in one case to the appearance of a thinking body, and in other case simply to a body, a stone, a tree, etc. This is why the function of thought can only be grasped through the entire system of interactions, and which is why Spinoza can conclude that thinking body is nature in its entirety. So we must already note the great distance between the activity of the thinking body and the passive affects that arise in the encounters of the bodies as it imagines. For Ilyenkov's metaphysics of the thinking body, however, another mode of symbolization becomes conceivable that is not passive but active in nature. In order to further explore the active property of nature, Ilyenkov points to the necessity of conceiving a mode of active interaction of the body with respect to other bodies. Ilyenkov argues that the thinking body, and this is quote number 1 on the handout, actively builds, constructs the form or trajectory of its own movement in space. So a thinking body constructs its own movement in conformity with the form, configuration, and position of the other body, coordinating the form of its own movement, its own activity, with the form of the other body, whatever it is. The specific form of activity of the thinking body then is its universality. That is, a capacity to adapt to infinite forms of encounter. So this is what distinguishes the active thinking body from just a body, is a capacity to universally adapt to different encounters. The degree of this capacity that Spinoza characterizes as a capacity to be affected in a plurality of ways is the gradations or level of perfection of the thinking body. Ilyenkov, in turn, radicalizes this line of thought to speculate that the highest degree of perfection, the highest active capacity of thought, consists in the minimum of pre-given forms of action and in maximum plasticity of adaptation to the form of encounters of other bodies. Quote number 2, a thinking thing, Ilyenkov writes, not having any ready-made schemes of action within it, acts in agreement with whatever scheme is dictated to it at a given moment by the forms and combinations of other bodies outside it. The potential infinity of activity of the thinking body, however, is circumscribed by habit and memory, in this case, cultural memory and cross-generational social habit, by the forms of interactions that are socially valid and historically determined. According to Ilyenkov, Spinoza's idea of the thinking body in terms of activity that finds expression both in the attributes of thought and extension was first grasped by Marx and Engels, a moment that also constitutes their departure from Hegel. For Marx, Ilyenkov points out, quote, man only thinks when located in the unity with society, and the man abstracted from the nexus of social relations thinks as little as Spinoza's body that does not act. Consequently, the dialectical schemas and categories developed by Hegel amount to forms of thought that merely reflect the general forms of objective activity of social being, activity that is determined by the development of culture and productive forces of society, in the active form of human capacity to transform the world it encounters. The category of the ideal for Ilyenkov occupies a central role in grasping this process. Ideal, first of all, concerns, quote, the active aspect of the relation of thinking man to nature. More properly, you should say a thinking thing to nature. The general images, what Spinoza calls universals, that are in part produced by language, arise not from the transhistorical structures of thought, as Hegel thought, but through practical objective transformation of nature by society. Quote number 3. Ideal is the subjective image of objective reality, that is, reflection of the external world in the forms of man's activity, arises immediately only as the form, mode, image of activity of social man, of an entirely objective material being directed to the external world. Ideal, that is to say, dynamic social human form of activity, unlike language, pertains to the attribute of thought. It manifests itself on the level of extension as the activity of the body, but this activity is not identical to ideal itself. So number 4, quote number 4, the material being of the ideal is not itself ideal, but only the form of its expression in the organic body of the individual. In itself, the ideal is, quote, the socially determined form of man's life activity corresponding to the form of its object and product. In other words, the ideal is the activity of the thinking body expressed under the attribute of thought, an activity of the encounter of these bodies and its adequation of action with respect to the forms that this body encounters. Only now, Ilyenkov posits ideal as a specific form of activity of thought that is mediated by socially and historically determined mode of encounters. So, for example, capitalist mode of production produces a certain regularity of forms of encounters, right? So the universality of the thinking body is circumscribed, say, by dominant social relation, that is exchange of commodities, yes? Importantly, Ilyenkov, like Spinoza, relegates language to the attribute of extension. Language is not the ideal, but, quote, a form of expression of the ideal, its material objective being, now historically and socially circumscribed. To give an example from Spinoza, encountering a trace of a horse, a peasant thinks of the horse and then the plow, while the soldier passes from the image of the trace of the horse to the image of war. In this case, the linkage of images is conditioned on the one hand by biography of the individual, how the body has previously been affected, so different for the soldier than from the peasant, and by social forms of material activity, that is agriculture or war. In the case of the Roman, who encountering the word pomum goes to think of the fruit, whether they're a peasant or a soldier does not matter, yes? The case is different because it does not rely on biography. This is because, to quote Moreau, the association of one, pomum, with another, fruit, is already constituted as a collective fact, a fundamentally collective phenomenon. This is the relation of the ideal under the attribute of thought and its manifestation as objective material reality under the attribute of extension. Still, the phenomenon of language alone is insufficient for the realization of the ideal under the attribute of extension, just as language for Spinoza carries with it a danger of inadequacy. Quote number 5. Rather, argues Ilyenkov, an object is idealized, that is, its form for thought is the acquired adequate form of the external object. So the object is idealized, I repeat, only when the capacity to actively reproduce it is present, relying on language of words and drawings, a capacity of converting words into deeds and through deeds into things. To illustrate this point with respect to Marx, Ilyenkov draws on Spinoza, who, according to Ilyenkov, quote, linked adequate ideas expressed in the words of language precisely with the ability to reproduce given verbal forms in real space. The example concerns the definition of a circle and its nominal and essential determinations. The definition of the circle as a figure in which lines drawn from the center to the circumference were equal, argues Ilyenkov, does not express the essence of a circle, but only a certain property of it, that is to say, a derivative property. Ilyenkov continues. This is quote number 6. A circle should be defined as a figure described by any line, one end of which was fixed and the other moved. This definition provides the mode of constructing the thing in real space. So the proper definition is how you construct it in real space, yes? Here, the nominal definition arises together with the real action of the thinking body along the spatial contour of the object of the idea. In that case, man also possesses an adequate idea, that is, an ideal image, and not just signs expressed in words, that is also a materialist conception of the nature of the ideal. The ideal, then, on the level of thought, accords with the capacity of the body on the level of extension to reproduce the idealized object by the mediation of symbolization. That is, by schemas, languages, signs, and so on. The perpetual and processual circuit of the ideal then expressed under the attribute of extension as follows: thing, act, word, act, thing, and so on. This Spinozan conception of the ideal for Ilyenkov is strictly dialectical because the ideal is a being that is at once another being's non-being, that is, only as an active capacity, posited as pure potentiality. This dialectical aspect of the ideal is manifested in the symbol. Symbol, remaining itself, is at the same time the being of another body, its ideal being, which bears no similitude to that body. Labor is precisely the active process of becoming real of the ideal according to the socially conditioned forms that the body encounters. Marx exemplifies the idealization of reality, that is, the formal active appropriation of objective material forms of reality as a potential capacity for its reproduction, in the concept of price. In chapter 3 of Capital, Marx writes, quote, "The price or money form of commodities is, like their form of value generally, quite distinct from their palpable and real bodily form. It is, therefore, a purely ideal form." Whereas the idealist interpretation of price maintains it as a purely subjective phenomenon, Marx's materialist approach admits the material reality of the ideal. In other words, in a society where commodities are produced in order to sell, the commodity always already ideally exists as money. Summarized, of course, by Marx's general formula MCM. C is always converted to M. Money, or the general equivalent that Marx derives at the end of chapter 1, is the social function of valuation of the products of labor realized through active exchanges on the market. Here, a further distinction emerges between ideal function as symbol and sign. The distinction corresponds between symbol and sign to Spinoza's theory of the imaginary and language, whereas the trace of a horse remaining itself comes to be a symbolic existence of something else, war for the soldier, plow for the peasant. The word pomum for the Roman does not tie together idea and image, but, to repeat myself, idea and two images. It is, in other words, a sign rather than a symbol. That is, image of the image, to quote Morogian, that is a fundamentally collective phenomenon. In Marx, this dynamic manifests itself as follows. From the relative form of value, 20 yards of linen equals 1 coat, Marx derives the expanded form of value in which, quote, a particular product of labor, such as cattle, or it may be linen, or it may be gold, is no longer exceptionally, but habitually exchanged for various other commodities. It is through this form that commodities, I'm quoting, are really brought into relation with each other as values, insofar as the form of value possesses social validity. That is, social validity that emerges first through habit and then through convention. That is, through active practices of exchange. As values, commodities are idealized through the general equivalent. Gold, or it could be linen, or it could be something else, cattle, Ilyenkov writes, while remaining itself, in the process of circulation, nevertheless proved to be immediately the form of existence and movement of a certain other, represented and replaced that other, and turns out to be its metamorphosis. That is, the equivalent commodity, gold, cattle, or linen, does not figure in exchange in its bodily function, but only ideally. And as such, it turns into a symbol. The symbol, of course, of social relations between humans, yes? The development of money form, in turn, is possible due to the fact, so how money form can arise at all, yes? Due to the fact that in the active processes of exchange, both the commodity and the general equivalent are already idealized, due to the fact, quote, that the act of exchange posits an already formed system of relations between people mediated by things. That is, the system of social relations, reproduced habitually and through social convention, enables an extraction of a single commodity, which, while remaining itself, turns into the representative of any other body as its ideal image. In this case, the exceptional commodity functions as a symbol. The symbolic mediation, in turn, serves as the presupposition of the adequate form of active capacity of bodies that enter exchanges. That is to say, an adequate mediation of social relations. Money, on the other hand, no longer functions as a symbol, but a sign. Ilyenkov explicates the dynamic between the symbol and sign as follows. Quote number 7. This is a long block quote. The corporeal, sensually perceived envelope or body of the symbol, the body of the thing that has been transformed into a symbol, for example, gold, is quite unessential, transient, and temporary for its existence as a symbol. The functional existence of such a thing completely absorbs its material existence, as Marx puts it. Furthermore, the material body of the thing is brought into conformity with its function. As a result, the symbol is converted into a sign, into an object that already means nothing in itself, but only represents or expresses another object with which it itself has nothing in common, like the name of the thing with the thing itself. End quote. The symbol is the embodiment of the ideal. Its realization of the attribute of extension becomes sign when its bodily manifestation becomes consonant with its representative function, when gold or cattle or linen becomes money. Or to put it in Spinoza's terms, when the linkage of images via linkage of habit and memory becomes language, a collective phenomenon that pre-exists the biography of individual body. This is what Ilienkov calls the dialectic of transformation of a thing into a symbol and of a symbol into a sign that is, quote, traced in capital on the example of the origin and evolution of the money form of value. This process of symbolization, so simplified in the perpetual circuit of thing, act, word, act, thing. Yes. So this process of symbolization, far from being an impediment to adequate knowledge, is rather its condition of possibility. Adequate knowledge, in this case, being the active capacity of the thinking thing to incorporate and reproduce the forms of bodies it encounters. Ilienkov writes, without an ideal image, man cannot realize the exchange of matter with nature, and the individual cannot operate with things involved in the process of social production. Labor, therefore, presupposes and necessitates language. At the same time, the confusion of the ideal, which is a form of active capacity of a thinking body, so the confusion of the ideal and the symbol, which is the embodiment on the level of extension, gives rise to what Ilienkov calls fetishization of linguistic being of the ideal. The process of fetishization, quote, registers the results of human activity, but not man's activity itself. So when the symbol or the image come to stand for the ideal, the very active capacity of the thinking body decreases. In this case, quote, it is not the individual who operates with the ideal image, but the dogmatized ideal image that acts in and through the individual. Here it is not the ideal image that is a real function of the individual, but on the contrary, the individual who is a function of the image, which dominates his mind and will as an externally given formal scheme, as a fetish. So the function of the ideal, then, is both the presupposition of adequate knowledge and the condition of error. The difference between the two consists in the potential dynamicity of the ideal, insofar as it is transformed, modified, according to singular circumstances and demands of the time. This dynamic is fully consonant with Ilienkov's discussion of thought with respect to Spinoza. A thinking body encounters external bodies which produce effects or images to which the form of activity of the body must adapt. When, however, a thinking body transfers this form or mode of activity produced in a singular encounter onto another thing, unlike the first one, the inadequate idea as a form of inadequate activity arises. So Ilienkov writes, error begins only there where limited correct mode of action is given a universal meaning, there where the relative is taken for the absolute. This is the error Spinoza describes as the production of transcendental terms and universal notions, which, as I pointed out before already, arises precisely as a function of symbolization as a common characteristic unable to grasp singular differences, because the body was affected more repeatedly by a given image, to which it consequently gives the status of universal notion or transcendental term. On the other hand, Ilienkov writes, through, quote, the form of thinking body's own movement along the contours, and this is, I believe, another quote I placed on the handout. Through the form of thinking body's own movement along the contours of external objects, the thinking body also creates an adequate idea of the forms and contours of the objects themselves, because it is one and the same form, one and the same contour. Idealization is a practical capacity to reproduce this contour under singular circumstances, is the condition of this process, that is, of the process of what Spinoza describes as, quote, the power of ordering and connecting the affections of the body according to the order of the intellect. This is only possible, Ilienkov adds, through practical activity and singular adaptation of its form according to socially and historically determined circumstances. Spinoza's definition of the third kind of knowledge as the knowledge of singular things under the species of eternity then means for Ilienkov nothing other than the knowledge of singular things made possible through the function of the ideal under the attribute of thought, as a capacity of real activity, which manifests itself on the level of extension as the capacity for reproduction or realization of singular things through collective and social productive activity. So, in conclusion, Ilienkov's interpretation of the relation between the attributes of thought and extension as two manifestations of the activity of a thinking body in conversation with Marx's analysis of the commodity gives rise to the following conclusion. Ideal, as the function of thought, as the function of abstraction from real activity of the body in its encounters with other bodies, which manifests itself in the process of symbolization under the attribute of extension, exemplified in language, is a transhistorical function. So ideal on the level of thought, symbolization on the level of extension is a transhistorical function. That is, the process of idealization is one mode of existence of substance under the attribute of thought, and the process of symbolization is one mode of existence of substance under the attribute of extension. This transhistorical function of substance takes a specific form of abstraction under the capitalist mode of production, which provides the regularity of specific forms of encounters of thinking things, such as market exchanges. And commodities too here should be considered thinking things. They talk to each other, you know. And that is, the transhistorical function of the ideal manifests itself under the capitalist mode of production as the dialectic of the transformation of a thing into a symbol and the symbol into a sign. This specific form of transhistorical function of the ideal emerges when the commodity form becomes the dominant idealization of social relations, that is, commodity fetishism. When the symbol and sign are fetishized, when the symbol or sign become consonant with the ideal, the structure of commodity fetishism reduces the power of activity of the thinking body to the level where the individual becomes a function of the image. At the same time, commodity fetishism, due to its function of symbolization under the attribute of extension and idealization under the attribute of thought, and remember, commodity fetishism means that social relations between men are mediated by things, yes? So commodity fetishism is the specific structure that enables adequate knowledge under the capitalist mode of production, where the structure of being can coincide with the structure of thought as an active capacity to reproduce it, or with Spinoza, where ordering and connecting of the affections of the body is possible according to the order of the intellect. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Sergey. And so we can take 30, 40 minutes for our debate. If someone wanted to ask something, if there is some questions, I think that if someone prefer to ask in Italian, and we can translate for Sergey, or Daniela can receive a question in Italian too. And I see that Khan want to ask something if you want to speak.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for the presentations. These are extremely insightful. For an outsider like myself, for the Spinoza research, although I'm a bit familiar with the early Soviet debates, the debates and so on. So I have two questions, but I'm not sure whether, I'm not clear about the questions or the answers to these questions. I'm just curious how you would react to these questions. The first one is this: why Spinoza rather than Leibniz? And the second question is, what is the connection between Hegel and Spinoza, as this was understood by Deborin and Ilyenkov? Now, the first question is triggered by my interest in Leibniz, and you would see there is a competition, a theoretical, philosophical competition between Spinoza and Leibniz heritage in the Marxist thought. You would recall that the young Marx, when he was working on his Berlin notebooks, he also made excerpts from Leibniz before he came to Spinoza. And then, Feuerbach wrote a book on Leibniz, which Lenin read. And then we have the so-called Theoria Atragenia, the reflection theory, that is extremely powerful in the Soviet philosophy. We have Todor Pavlov, for instance, in Bulgaria, who wrote a big tome on that. And the connection is Leibniz understands the universe as a system of interrelated reflections when it speaks of the monads as mirroring the universe from their own perspective and standpoint. And then we have one single example of the Soviet work on Leibniz that is from Igor Narsky, right? So I was curious why single out Spinoza rather than Leibniz, especially when there is this sort of Leibnizian background both in Marx and the Soviet philosophy. And a related issue that concerns me is this problematic emphasis in Spinoza on the substance monism in contradistinction to substance pluralism that point in Leibniz. So I was just curious as to whether there is a specific reason that Spinoza is singled out rather than the competing figure, which was Leibniz. And about the second question, I'm not clear about this question at all. That is, I don't know how to answer this question. That's why I'm just curious what you think. This Hegelian dialectics and the connection that is made with Spinoza and the Soviet thought. Daniela emphasized, I believe, to some extent in an exaggerating manner, that Spinoza was the most important figure in Soviet philosophy. If you ignore Hegel, well, that is a bit difficult to do. So we know that Deborin was heavily involved in Hegel. Ilyenkov was heavily involved in Hegel. But Hegel is huge. That is, if you look at the greater logic, for instance, there's the logic of being, logic of essence, logic of concept, and depending on what you take into account, you can come up with a different understanding of dialectics. Then, so what exactly is the connection between this logical system and the Spinoza as it is theorized by Deborin and Ilyenkov? Thank you.
Maybe we can collect some questions before then give you again the floor. I don't know if Vittorio want to speak, and then Sam also. Okay, Vittorio, and then Sam.
It's a brief question for Daniela, because she has spoken about the theory of perception, the interpretation of the theory of perception in Plekhanov of Spinoza. And it seems to me very interesting, the idea of the hieroglyphic. And I would know if there is a relation, if Plekhanov poses a relation between this interpretation of the theory of perception and the theory of commodities in Marx chapter 1. Social hieroglyphic or something like that. It seems to me very interesting. Thank you.
Sam, let's go.
Thanks. I had a question for Sergey. I was wondering if you could explain in more detail about the difference between kind of like the transhistorical aspect of symbolization and the historically specific phenomenon of fetishization, but as it pertains to language, I guess I'm wondering, I couldn't tell if you think that something about the capitalist mode of production creates, like, does it also create a kind of, this phenomenon of fetishization where we are, dominated by signs in language, or is that only happening in the, in terms of commodity fetishism and the exchange of commodities, and like the function of language is like unaffected or something? I was curious what you think about that.
And me too. I will be brief because it's like the same question, or the following part of the same question of Vittorio, because I'm very interested to ask to Daniela some information more about the Plekhanov interpretation of the first genre of knowledge. And the first one was the hieroglyphics, and how some I haven't think to the Marxian reference, that maybe it's the right answer by Vittorio, but how the hieroglyphs like something of a very minimal or stylized can be the terms to explain something of so complex as the sensation, the perception, that is always multiples sensations that is connected between each other in Spinoza. So it's a very bit strange to the reference to the hieroglyphs. And the second one is you said the quotation you propose us Plekhanov said something like hieroglyphs are not similar to the things, to the events, but they are able to communicate the events, the thing. And this distinction, they are not similar to, but they communicate them, is very interesting for the Spinozism in the also in the later 60s, 70s. I mean, the imagination as production and not as representation. Because if hieroglyphs can communicate, can produce a new relation, can communicate as a production of communication and not a representation, not to be similar to. And I wonder if there is in Plekhanov also outside of this quotation an idea, a first idea that the productivity of the imaginary, the imaginary production that was so important then in Althusser, for example, or other Marxist authors. And I think that you can answer because there is not other questions if I'm right. Yeah, I think that you can start answering. I think Daniela firstly and Sergey secondly.
Okay, thank you very, very much for all of you for the questions, and Sergey for the incredibly dense and very interesting thing that he said, a lot of things he said, and I think I could probably add some other questions. But anyway, let's first answer. So Khan, why Spinoza rather than Leibniz? Historians have always a very easy way to get out of these questions because it happened that Spinoza was present. Well, I think that actually that makes sense. Spinoza was in the Russian context present already in a very materialistic way of understanding. He was read by Chernyshevsky. Spinoza was in the, how can I say, in the pantheon of the progressive thinkers. Leibniz was very popular at some point, mostly at the second half of the 19th century, in mathematical circles, as an understanding. He had some idealistic interpretations. He was popular in different circles. And I think that the way that the reception of a certain thought arrives into Russia actually affects the popularity and the, how can I say, the horizon of expectations of the people who read the certain thinker. So that I think there is there also a specific historical situation. Why Spinoza rather than Leibniz? And Plekhanov there has a peculiar responsibility because he was he became the thinker of Russian Marxism for a long time, and he had no interest in Leibniz. The fact that Marx commented, etc. Well, we have to think that their knowledge of Marxist writings themselves at the end of the 19th century, the beginning of the 20th, was affected by millions of different situations. They had no collected works. They had no manuscripts. They had no, they were affected sometimes by the fact that a certain article was published in a certain place and they had access to that and they didn't have to some other works. So it was very unbalanced and very bizarre. Sometimes really historical contingencies have a power, which is a very easy way for historians to get out of the questions, of course, because there is a real theoretical questions there. I understand that. Monism versus pluralism is the theoretical question. But I have no other answers than the historical one. It happens. Hegel and Spinoza. Oh, wow. Of course, we were talking about Spinoza. So Spinoza was the topic of our conversation today, but Hegel was obviously important. One thing that I think it's interesting is that Hegel himself is considered, at least by Plekhanov, like somehow a Spinozist, in the sense that the interest of the relationship between freedom and necessity. We didn't talk about that today, but this is very important as well, because Marxism basically has such a success in Russia, proposing itself as a system that has guarantee about the success of the action. And the guarantee comes from the laws of history. And the laws of history are what Hegel pointed out, but the fact that the subject can affect history, can act in history, exactly because the subject knows what the laws of history are, and therefore their action is effective, is exactly what Plekhanov read as, again, the relationship between necessity and freedom, as in Spinoza. So there is a connection also between Spinoza and Hegel in the way Plekhanov read this. And I believe there is also in Deborin, who on this respect, reading about the reading of Hegel, is probably the most faithful follower of Plekhanov, I think. Vittorio and Andrea about the theory of perception, and particularly the hieroglyphics. I also find hieroglyphics very interesting and intriguing, but I must say Plekhanov himself gave up the terminology, so the name is just the name of the concept. However, he didn't change so much the concept being that our perception gives us elements that that are not necessarily similar to the object, but he has a very positivistic idea, that is our senses, our sense organs work as a sort of a filter. So the sensation we have, the sensation we have in the sound, the sight, etc., is not exactly what it is outside. There is a huge questions about the thing in itself. This is a huge topic in Russian Marxism. I mean, literally workers in the factory discussed about the thing in itself, because the problem became how we know the reality, and if we don't know the reality, how we can act in reality, which is Ilyenkov's problem in a way, all over again. It's so important, the knowledge. I mean, that's why Russian Marxism is so obsessed about knowledge, because if we don't know what to do, and our effective action, it depends on our knowledge. So coming back to the perception, we don't know exactly. Our perception are not the mirror image of the thing, and even the mirror image is not exactly the thing. So it has elements that are different, but it's not arbitrary. It's not what is not subjective is the relation. So we have different perception of the world, but the relation about these elements of perceptions are exactly what they are. I mean, the law is there, the regularity, the закономерность, the fact that things are connected one to the other in a certain way. As for the origin of the hieroglyphic, I have no idea. I never found a source in Plekhanov that connects with the Marx idea of the commodities. No idea at all. The only thing that I found is a reference to Diderot, which sort of makes sense, because Plekhanov was, well, as Bogdanov said always, he was more a French materialist than a Marxist himself in a way. In this sense, also, I think we can start from the theory of hieroglyphics and work about the difference between imagination and representation, but probably it is to force Plekhanov in a way that it wasn't his own. I mean, his reference is really very much on the physiological studies of his time. He has Lenin in Materialism and Imperial Criticism, when he criticized Plekhanov's hieroglyphs, he says Plekhanov is like Helmholtz. Actually is not, but there is a connection, because Plekhanov himself says that he follows Sechenov, who was a Russian student of Helmholtz at some point. So the idea is actually that the physiology of the nervous system explains why we perceive the world in certain ways. It's not important if I am short-sighted and I see something differently than a person that doesn't wear glasses, etc. The important thing is that we all have the same relation with it, what we actually see. That's more or less the answer. I think I can stop here. Thank you.
If I may add to Daniela's points here, why not Leibniz? Precisely in the Russian tradition, I agree with you, Daniela. Leibniz was a philosopher of the bosses, right? Remember that Wolff, the student of Leibniz who popularized Leibniz in the 18th century, was imported by Peter the Great to establish the Russian Academy of Sciences. In fact, Leibniz's philosophy was the justification of Peter's autocratic rule and his, whatever it's called, table of this hierarchy of society, this semi-feudal or feudal even hierarchy of society. So this is one. So there are a number, of course, strategic reasons, such as the theological inclination and so on. But I think for Ilyenkov in particular, there are two reasons that are important. For Ilyenkov, the connection between logical and historical is the central concern in all of his works. And he is able to discover history and the connection between logic and history, both in Hegel and in Spinoza, but not in Leibniz. So this is one. And the second one, to Andrea's point, rather than reflection, it is a question of production, of productivity that is central to both Hegel and Spinoza. This productivity of imagination and so on and so forth. And that was production as activity was important, I think, for Ilyenkov. To the second point, why not Hegel? Hegel, of course, plays a central role for Ilyenkov, but it is quite interesting that it is always, Hegel is discussed in Ilyenkov always like a stepstone to Marx, and then he always takes recourse, but Spinoza already understood it in the language of his time. So whatever Marx advance made over Hegel, Spinoza already understood, yes. But in any case, why centrality of Hegel nonetheless is this obsession with the dialectic, right? The obsession of the Spinozist tradition with the dialectic, in fact, to find the dialectic in Spinoza, where the dialectic is possible in Spinoza. This is the question that Macharet posed, famously, that Althusser posed, and so on and so forth. And the debates, Daniela knows this better than I, especially in, say, 1920s, 1927, under the banner of Marxism, dedicated to Spinoza. If you read every article, is a new discovery of the dialectic in Spinoza every single time. And Ilyenkov believes to have found it in a very innovative way. So to Sam's question, so if I may reiterate, it was a very complex question. So I made this gambit, if you will, a speculative move at the end, but I think it is a proper conclusion that the idealization and symbolization are transhistorical functions of the thinking body on the one hand, and that it takes a specific form as commodity fetishism under capitalist mode of production. Yes. So, and you asked with respect to this, the function of language, the centrality of language, yes. So what is interesting in Ilyenkov, what I'm still grappling with, that I find so promising, is that Ilyenkov poses a question he displaces the importance of language that is placed on language in the 20th century and asks the question, how is language possible at all? What is it about our body under both attributes that necessitates language? So language becomes only secondary to ideal and only one mode of symbolization among others. Now, what intrigues me, and so he uses, Ilyenkov uses this in a debate against structuralism and against, say, Wittgenstein, right? So he wants to create a Marxism that is able to answer structuralism and answer Wittgenstein. And he strategically displaces the function of language in this way. Now, what haunts me, as it were, is if I claim with Spinoza or with Ilyenkov and Spinoza, this transhistorical function of symbolization, my intuition is that this question, the question about symbolization in this form, can only be adequately posed under capitalist mode of production, under commodity fetishism. So this is why Spinoza was able to do it and not somebody before that, because it seems to me that under commodity fetishism or under capitalist mode of production, the intensity of different symbolic systems just proliferate. Like you read Marx, the commodities are citizens of the world, they're always talking to each other, values, language, and so on and so forth. So, so what it seems to me that this displacement of language as secondary perhaps can understand, help us understand this intensification of orders of symbolization on the level of extension with respect to capitalism. So, so there is, in a sense, what I would say, a difference of degree, right? And also a difference in the mode of domination of symbols over ideal that is quite apparent under capitalism, that capitalism makes us quite passive. So in that sense, I think it creates a certain obstacle to adequate knowledge that both Spinoza and Ilyenkov try to grapple with.
Thank you for your answers. Is there any other questions? There is no other questions. So I think it was a very interesting debate about not so well-known authors and interpretations. So I hope it was useful and interesting also for the public. I thanks all the participants, and I would like to invite Daniele and Sharei to stay in the call 2 minutes more with me for just last information. And for all the others, I remind for the last time that our next meeting will be in the 29th of November at 5 o'clock about André Tosel interpretation of Spinoza political thought with Chantal Jacquet and David Maruzzella. And I hope to see all of you in this following occasion. And good evening to everyone.
Thank you for everybody.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you. It was fun to see some of faces that I know the name of. I never saw the people. So thank you.